The Culture and Animals Foundation. Think, create, explore, celebrate.
Today, we're going to be talking about Abandon Every Hope, Essays for the Dead, a remarkable work by the Australian scholar and writer Hayley Singer. Before I introduce Hayley, let me just clarify who we are. My name is Martin Rowe, and I'm the Executive Director of the Culture and Animals Foundation, or CAF, which is a US-based non-profit organization dedicated to promoting the rights of animals through intellectual and creative expression. As well as my work with CAF, I am myself a writer of works of fiction and nonfiction, and was also the co-founder of Lantern Books and Lantern Publishing and Media, which has published over 250 works on animal rights, veganism, religion, and social justice. Joining me is Jesseka Batteau, a poet who holds a PhD in literary studies and is a member of the Provincial Parliament of Utrecht for the Dutch Party of the Animals. So about Hayley Singer, she teaches contemporary eco-fictions and feminist ecologies of writing at the University of Melbourne, Australia. In 2019, Hayley received a grant from the Culture and Animals Foundation for Lives, Not Livestock, a public narrative project which aimed to investigate the role of farmed animal sanctuaries during extreme climate disaster via recorded interviews and participatory research at sanctuary sites that have experienced disaster. And you can find out more about that project and many other CAF grants made over the years at our website, cultureandanimals.org. Abandon Every Hope, Essays for the Dead was published in spring 2023 by Upswell Publishing. And Jesseka and I were so struck by its format, its content, and tone that we decided we had to ask Hayley about it. Actually, Jesseka and I find ourselves not so much as being able to form our own questions about Abandon Every Hope, as you will discover, but meditating on the many questions that Hayley asks in the book, which is a furious, giddy, desperate cri de coeur about the state of the world. So anyway, well, let me stop talking and welcome you, Hayley and Jesseka, and ask you, first of all, Hayley, our first question, which is the standard one that is asked in these kinds of interviews. How did you come to write this extraordinary book?
Thank you so much, Martin. It's really good to be here talking with you and Jesseka, and thank you for that really generous introduction for the book. The book started a long time ago, actually, when I was starting my PhD at the University of Melbourne in creative writing, and I'm a total library animist. I know about the Dewey system, I understand how it works, but I rarely follow it unless I have a very particular book in mind. Back in those days when being on campus was a lot more practiced than it is in these sort of pandemic times, I used to wander around the library thinking about the things that felt really important to me. And coming into my PhD, I knew I wanted to focus on something in relation to, I was vegetarian at that time. I really wanted the PhD study to really solidify my ethical commitments in the world. And I was wandering around, and out of context, Carol Adams' The Sexual Politics of Meat was just sort of slumped in a shelf. I picked it up and started to read it, and I was just completely taken with this book, and then spent my entire PhD sitting with that text, and then connected up with the incredible people in critical animal studies here on this continent. So the PhD that I wrote became the basis of this book. I was going to turn that PhD into a monograph. I was really beautifully supported by a lot of people to turn that into a monograph, but I was extremely bored by the genre or the way that I was writing into that space. So I started to talk to one of my mentors in the creative writing program at Melbourne University, and she was really hearing the issues that I was having with the way that I was writing into the monograph space, and I was feeling desperate that I couldn't even read this book, and I didn't think that anybody else would read this book, and the topic is too important to write something that might not be read. So she suggested that I had two options, which is write the monograph, publish it and be done, or burn it to the ground and start again. And so I burnt it to the ground and I started again. And so I think that the book as it is now is an artifact that has really come out of the ruins that I created out of many, many years of thinking and writing and observing the world. You will both know how painful writing any sort of full-length document is, but saying goodbye to a document in such a way was quite painful. But I knew it was what I had to do, and I had to write in a way where I was leaving everything on the page and I wasn't keeping anything left over. I had no more energy when I finished writing this book. It's a thing risen from a ruin.
Yeah, it's impressive how you describe it. It's as this painful process. And rising from the ruins is also a very powerful image for me. The question for me that arose is something that what I've been thinking about myself, but it's something that arose was you write about violence perpetrated against animals in an incredibly powerful way, and was really blown away. And every time I read your book again, I find new things and new entrances, let's say, to think about the subject. But one of the entrances I was thinking about was perpetratorship, in the sense that it feels to me that when we're talking about violence perpetrated against animals, we are talking about the animals often, but not so much about us ourselves perpetrating the violence. And in your book, you have several references to fictional examples of perpetratorship in which the deeds committed are affecting the individual and either becomes mad, becomes undead, or becomes animal. I was wondering, is this one of the ways or entrances of ways of approaching the subject that would also help to make more visible what we are doing to animals, but also what we are doing to ourselves?
Yeah, thank you so much for that. I really think so. I think this is one of the things that I kept running into when I was writing a sort of more scholarly document, is that I kept lapsing into these sort of moralizing tones. And I found myself projecting my own sense of anguish about what is going on to multi-beings in industrial contexts onto other people. And I felt that this was wrong because not everybody feels the way that I do. And it was when I was returning to the novels and thinking about working with them differently that I started to realize I didn't have to project anything onto anyone. I could actually just work with these fictional examples, which will be connected to almost anyone in many different ways, because these characters are so specific. And because what happens in a novel is you get that incredible perspective of the internal, like the interior of a person, the exterior of a person. We get to look forward, we get to look backward, all in the space of a single page or a single paragraph. So you get this incredibly complex perspective within the space of a novel. And that can do so much communicative work that many kinds of writing can't permit themselves to step over certain boundaries, but novels can go there. They sort of have that incredible power of perspectival shift. I realized that if I worked with these people within these novels, then I might avoid the defensive trigger that an activist or somebody who is talking about and for the rights of animals trips in people who aren't yet there. I was thinking, how on earth can I write this book in a way that other writers might read it, or that people who aren't necessarily going to pick up a book on animal rights, what would get them to read about animal rights? If I had fictional characters, there might feel like this really sort of safe distance where they could hold that character up and sort of think about that fictional perpetrator in a way that might not directly ask them to feel implicated in what they might be quite literally buying into. The big thing that I'm finding now that I'm talking to people now that this book is in the world is that, and a lot of people are saying to me, like, I bought your book, I'm too scared to read it. It's like, okay. So I have something to say about that. The idea of an essay is sort of maybe very loosely used in the context of this book. So the book has really been written in a way where it's absolutely not to be necessarily to be read cover to cover. It's like you could pick it up, read the 1.5 pages or 2 pages or 3 pages that constitute a single essay, and you could sort of cherry pick your way through this book and know that every piece will in some way speak to another one of the pieces. So even if you pick it up at random and read it quite randomly and sort of microdosing the book, you will still get the effect of the dialogue that is played out across the entire book, just as if you might read it cover to cover. Jesseka, you've really picked up on it, the fact that I am thinking about perpetrators through fiction, through novels, because I think that it will allow people to approach, what does it look like? What does it feel like? What does it sound like to perpetrate violence against other beings? And then what does it look and sound like when you are sickened by what is happening to animals all over the world? People just don't allow themselves to be sickened by it. And I think that's a problem. I think we all just need to be really deeply and constantly in touch with how sickening it is.
One of the many, many startling revelations of your extraordinary book is its neologisms, or its rediscovery of terms as a way to seek illimited slaughter, but also the limited way that we can even talk about that. So at the end of the book, you describe Abandon Every Hope as a thanatography, which you say is a form that works to invoke the unnamed dead. In this way, it is related to lament. It is also a prose poem formed as a collage of news items and images laid side by side, a strategy that attempts to give life to moments of death and remember the dead in a world that would have us forget, end quote. And then in the chapter Snuff, you define thanatography as an accounting of the dead. And in Raw/Cooked, obviously referring to Levi-Strauss, you say writing, if it is capable of doing anything at all, has to incite total animal liberation, has to move society towards a new form of existence, or it will be a failure, end quote. How do we as writers and creative people move from an accounting of the dead to inciting total animal liberation?
I have no idea. This is the first unanswerable moment, I think. It's so funny, this dream of mine, this aim, this maniacal thought that I had when I was sitting at my computer drafting and redrafting this book and, you know, feeling sick for a lot of it, sitting in this material, like when you've worked with material around violence against multi-beings for a long time, you can just start to feel quite ill. At least that's what my experience was. So I had this feeling like, surely this is what we all have to be aiming for, like complete and utter liberation. It's in there as like this wild provocation. But it is something that in reviews, people are like, oh, I think that's a bit overblown, don't you? Which is really, really hilarious because it's both a very serious question and it's also like this sort of astronomical ask. But in the very serious way that I'm posing the question, posing it to every single writer, the more of us who do this work, the louder our collective voice gets. And it's like when you try to plant bushes to outcompete invasive grasses, right? Like it might be that the bushes are, you know, far apart and they're slow growing, but then suddenly you realize over time that invasive grass is shaded and it can't continue to grow as vigorously as it could. Like I do think that that's what we can do with all of the books that we publish and all of the poems that we write. We can start to outcompete this invasive idea that violence against animals should be and always will be normal, and the basis on which so many of us live and enjoy life, right? So yeah, I think that this provocation towards total liberation is like, we need a strategy, but first we have to ask the question. And I know I'm not the first person to like start thinking about this, right? I'm not pretending like nobody's asked this question before, because I think it's implicit, if not explicit, in many, many books. But I think it's down to us to outcompete the normatized view or the normalized view that violence is normal, natural, and necessary. I think that there's a very real strategy that we can have. And it comes down to, you know, how many people have been affected by Carol Adams's The Sexual Politics of Meat. And I think about that book so often because she's planting all of these seeds in all of us who either find her book in a well-organized library or just stumble upon the book. And from Carol Adams, you find Laurie Gruen, and then you realize, wow, I'm already in a community of people who are thinking and doing this work. And that stuff really, I found that it emboldened me. And I felt like I didn't have to be worried about writing these things because I was simply putting my effort with the effort of so many other people. And I think that is how our writings could bring about total liberation. There is, a lot of conversation in creative writing about, can writing inspire action, or does action inspire writing? But I do think that the idea that we simply cannot know the effects that our works will have now or into the future is something worth writing for. This book could fall into the hands of somebody who just wants to change the way that they live to be less violent.
Yeah, I think you're right. It's like planting bombs. I mean, I don't want to talk in violent terms here, but you stumble upon something that has such a great impact. For me, it was Coetzee's Elizabeth Costello and Lives of Animals, which was also a way of trying to figure out which beams of darkness we need to stare into. And this attempt we are trying to make again and again to in fact look into that darkness, which I think we need to sort of invite the reader to also look. The challenge, I think, is really what will make the reader actually take this invitation and actually start reading the book and continue reading the book. While reading your book, I was seeing these connections between different concepts, I would say. I was trying to put into words how to describe them. And I was thinking of constellations or vectors. And I was also thinking of the word of bricolage, of that you're trying to use concepts we already are familiar with, but we use in different contexts, or you are actually in the book, trying to make different connections. And by these recontextualization, somehow something new is happening. Was this a strategy for you of opening up meaning between concepts as you connect them and finding like a new, let's say, linguistic universe almost to talk about this?
I think that is exactly what I was trying to do. There's a part in the book where I talk about, and this is drawing on many, many different thinkers, the fact that language is anemic when we come to talking about industrially bred, held and slaughtered animals. Language obviously becomes euphemistic, and beyond euphemism and practical terms, really the way that industrially bred animals are talked about is just so often bereft of meaning and has a very limited vocabulary. It occurred to me actually when I was experiencing chronic pain with an injury, and I was reading Elaine Scarry's book, The Body in Pain, because I realized I would go to a medical practitioner and they would say, like, what's going on? I'm like, oh, my back hurts. And it's like, no, I need to get so much more specific with this in order to actually get the help that I need. And that's a big thing that Elaine Scarry talks about, is the fact that, pain can destroy language. And we have to find that way back towards a complexity of language in order to talk about the pain. While I was writing the book, that was really quite big in my mind, which is we need a much more complex vocabulary in order to talk about what is going on everywhere around us in relation to the bits of animal bodies that are whizzing past us in restaurants, or that we're walking past in a supermarket, or the cows who might be looking at us over the fence of a paddock. We need language that is better than what we are currently equipped with. So I think I was trying to find those new creative pathways into and out of the language that we have and towards other terms that we might be able to use. I know that there are a lot of terms in this book that, like, we're just not going to use them in everyday life, Fleischgeist, that was actually the name of my PhD. That's a term that I found when I was researching the early days of my PhD. I found this boutique magazine called Meat Paper. It only had something like 20 issues, and it was looking at sort of meat culture all over the world. And in their first editorial, they proposed that they were writing the Fleischgeist, and they sort of just said, this is riffing off Hegel's concept of the zeitgeist, and they left it at that. And I thought, you don't just leave this term at that, like, good on them. I mean, that's a bold move to come up with such a great idea and then put it on the page and then sort of walk away from it. But I was really captivated by it. And, I started to think about and really started to theorize or elaborate in my thesis that the idea of the Fleischgeist can speak to both the spirit of the time as being one that is focused on sort of, living meat in terms of animals, multi-beings, bred and held and killed in industrial slaughterhouses, But also it could speak to the fact that we might very well, and I feel very haunted by what is going on all over the place in terms of animal slaughter. So Fleischgeist, I think, is a super useful tool to speak both to the fact that we're living in this like frenzied time where meat consumption is increasing despite everything that we know about the violence of it and its intersections with climate crisis, but that also there's this real hauntedness that's going on with people that feel so troubled, so disturbed, and that space and time is somehow queered. None of this is new, but I was trying to work with all of this in a new way, and the term Fleischgeist really gave me a way in. And there's lots of terms throughout the book that are allowing me these new routes into ideas that I had read during the course of my PhD. Yeah, I found that I was able to work with those ideas in ways that allowed me to feel like I could creatively access those ideas, which felt really important.
Yeah, that is one of the great gifts of the book, is this discovery of these terms. I also totally resonated with fecological, which felt very true. Is that a neologism? Did you make that one up, or is that also gathered from somewhere in the depths of your research?
No, that was made up. I just talk about shit a lot in the book, actually.
For your book, it felt like another evocation of an excremental vision. That the age we live in, the ecology that we live in, the Anthropocenic social ecology of this era is, in fact, the fecological era, as you brilliantly say. The danger with all such terms is they become flattened in the course of writing as opposed to intensified, because they become defined and contained within sentences. So how did you, as a writer, convey the horror of factory farms and what happens to animals, calibrate the wish to make sense of it by using such terms in order to describe the senselessness of this whole world that we live in?
Yet another excellent unanswerable question. I really enjoy it. Like, on the one hand, I am trying to make sense of it. That's why I'm writing about it. But I'm also just recognizing that making sense of it feels impossible to me, because when I look at the way we are literally turning the earth to shit, it is the most surreal sort of fact. For me, sense making can only be through some kind of perverse, upside down way of looking at the world. And that for me is like a kind of realism. And I've been thinking about this a lot, that a lot of the things that are going on that might be spoken about as some kind of like uber surrealism is actually just the realism of the moment that we are in, that fields are sprayed with shit and that poisons communities, that people can drown in pools of shit, that animals are standing, pigs are standing body deep in their own shit, and all of the other things that are coming out of them. This is the most surreal and awful thing, that there is no making sense of it. And I just allowed myself to not make sense of it. So I was able to draw on terms like fecological and just be like, that feels really right. We need to actually start to learn how to study the shit, because if we're not studying the shit, then we're not studying this moment in history, quite frankly. So there is a way in which I was just allowing those terms to be both good enough and also completely out of my grasp the whole time. And even now in this conversation, like, I think maybe in 10 years, I might be able to understand it more, but I'm just really sitting in that very strange space of feeling like, yes, I understand what that term is doing in the way that it calls certain knowledges or certain ideas into being and pins it to the page. But also it quite simply can't pin any of the true meaning to the page, because that true meaning really is the liquefied shit that we are making of the world. So, yeah, I'm just letting it be outside of my grasp as much as I'm using it, which makes talking about it really uncomfortable. But that's just what this book has to be. I can't say everything. I can't remember everything. I can't know it all. And I'm saying all of this because these are my impulses. I want to know everything. I want to remember everything. And I want to be able to answer everything. And I just know I can't, because even just beyond, the limitations of my own mind, it feels far too big It is far too big to fit into anything. I mean, it's astonishing that what we're doing on the planet can fit on the planet. I can't get my head around that. I mean, we know that the Earth can't handle it, right? We know that everything is collapsing. Yeah, it's astonishing, and it's impossible to hold.
Well, here in Holland, our whole country is grinding to a halt because of the shit. I mean, we have a big problem with manure, with, let's say, our agriculture, which has really escalated in a national crisis, in fact. So it's a complete excess of manure and shit, but it's also just let's say, practical political question as well. So it's we're running against this wall of how much we can actually do and let go and keep going on in the direction that we have been going for so long now, especially in Holland. I was thinking about, you were saying it goes beyond comprehension. We can't remember everything. It's such a big topic that we need to have different approaches to sort of start grasping it. One of the connected fields of meaning for me in your book was this notion of silence. And then there are different ways to approach this: silence, absence, amnesia. So, and then this was also connected to the notion of survival, abandonment. And I also really like the idea of the receptacles of the forgotten. So is this circling around memory and amnesia, remembering and witnessing, you could also say, because coming from a memory studies perspective, which is my background, I was triggered by this as well. Is this, we have a lot of concepts to talk about trauma in a human animal history. But I was wondering, how can we use these concepts to start thinking about or talking about violence perpetrated against animals? And indeed, there's always this connection that we need to tread carefully with, the connection to the Holocaust. But this is actually the iconic historical, let's say, reference in memory studies, at least, to talking about witnessing, remembering, etc. So I was wondering what your thoughts are on this, and how that applies to the violence that's been perpetrated this century, I would say, on animals.
I feel like this is a really sideways response, or maybe a walking away from the question entirely. So I'm really sorry if that's what I end up doing. I'm interested in thinking about what happens when people are called to the reality of what they are consuming. I know I'm not alone in this, but I think a lot about these really incredible activist campaigns that were happening here in Australia. It might have happened abroad too. Activists were going and putting stickers on meat packets that talked about who was packaged there and what their experiences were. The outrage of consumers of being called to what they were purchasing was really interesting to sort of watch from a distance through the internet, social media. And I was really interested in the fact that there is a really significant and unacknowledged generic habitat that sits over dinner tables, the meat aisle, butcher shop, which tells you when you enter those spaces, this is allowed to be said, this is not allowed to be said. And we don't even need this to be signaled to us. I move into those spaces and I know exactly what type of speech is prohibited. There's a way that transgressing these generic habitats is really taboo. So like Woolworths, like I talk about in the book, Woolworths can make a joke like, what do you call a cow with no legs? Ground beef, ha ha ha. That is somehow okay coming from the meat section at a supermarket. But an activist sticking a sticker on a packet that does a similar type of work, but is more abject and forestalls the punchline, right? There is no punchline. It stops the consumer before they can laugh because it takes your breath away. There are these ways that who is speaking and how they're speaking does a lot of memory work, a lot of memory trigger work, and I think calls people into the realization that they know more about what they are consuming than they even allow themselves to know, because activists do this work, right? They go into these spaces, they document, and they bring that documentation back out to the world. And we're swimming in that documentation. Even if people choose not to look at it, I would be so surprised if people did not know here in Australia at the moment that the horrors of live animal export had not yet again been broadcast on a major news program. So this information is out there, but people have all of those complex mechanisms of, shutting it off, detaching, looking the other way, and yet they still know. I think that we can puncture the forgetting. I think that we can puncture the walls. We can bend vision back towards what is going on. So these concepts can point us towards maybe creative modes of doing that. I'm really interested in what can art do in this space. And I think that creative protest is something that is really, really effective and can call us to our knowledge, the knowledge that we might not even realize is sitting right there in our heads. So I think that that's maybe what these terms could offer in time. Like if somebody were to sit down with them and think, how does this actually help me stage a protest somewhere? Like that. I think that could be really interesting. How do you work with so-called receptacles of the forgotten? What does that mean? What kind of public work needs to be out there? Or what kind of protest needs to happen in a supermarket? I was listening to a podcast that talked about this really incredible protest about the death of the artist Unnamed. The protest was these women went to the exhibition of Anna's husband, who has been accused of murdering her, and they simply stood around in the rooms of this art master and wept. And people were made so uncomfortable by this that ever since I've heard that, I thought, what if activists just stood in the meat aisle and wept? Could you be arrested? What kind of response would people have if you simply stood there and grieved? I think about these terms as routes or doorways or pathways towards more creative protests, more creative ways of accessing the knowledge that we have, but we might not recognize.
The book is also a book about COVID. The just-in-time inventory of delivering animals from farms to slaughterhouses couldn't be maintained when the slaughterhouses are closed. You write extraordinarily beautifully and clearly, sort of almost like a litany of the things that the farmers would have to do about it. So I would love you to read a section of that if you could.
So this chapter that you're talking about, the final essay, is called Inferno. And I'll just read from the start of it if that sounds good. It is reported that the crisis begins with the mass closure of restaurants, followed by slaughterhouses, due to infection rates among workers. This creates enormous bottlenecks in an inelastic agricultural supply chain. Millions of pigs are all fattened up with nowhere to go. On a conference call, a co-op of 9 farmers agree, though reluctantly, that they will start killing piglets. One believes his farm managers will do it by gas or injections, though he would prefer not to know. Pigs are fattened inside temperature-controlled buildings, designed to be slaughter-ready in 6 months. They can injure themselves if kept alive beyond this time. One pig breaks a leg under the pressure of her own body weight. A farmer kills pigs that have almost reached the upper weight limit for market, which is 136 kilos. When pigs reach 158 kilos, they can no longer be slaughtered commercially. They are too heavy for workers to hoist along the line. They are all dumped in landfill. With nowhere to ship fully grown pigs, another farmer orders employees to abort 7,500 piglets that will no longer fit into his units. To describe the situation of backlogging, Minnesota Pork Producers Association Chief Executive David Priestler says, "Imagine if in a school the seniors never graduate, but the kindergartners keep coming and you fill the gym, the lunchroom and hallways with students. Only he is not talking about students." JBS Foods converts shuttered processing plants into euthanizing facilities. Never before have so many farmers had to kill so many animals so quickly. One day, carts and tanks of carbon dioxide arrive at a farm gate. They are for the sole purpose of gassing 61,000 egg-laying hens. The farmers who usually sell liquid eggs to restaurants try to shift their market and sell whole eggs to stores. But as food shortages have set in, so has a shortage in the supply of egg cartons. Another farmer culls the smallest 5% of newborn pigs, or 125 piglets per week. He is not the only one. Small bodies can be composted and become fertilizer. No one will buy livestock because they no longer have the capacity to process them. Unemployment rises. People call for animals to be donated to food banks, but again, who will slaughter and process them? Processors are getting sick. Farmers start giving piglets away for free. Still, the price of pork rises 6.6% in supermarkets. Food lines grow. Photographs are posted online of empty or almost empty meat aisles. Conference call. A farmer describes the emotional strain of killing 3,000 pigs in a single day.
It seems just incomprehensible. And then, in a completely different sense, you talk about the laughter of the children at Georges Franju's Le Sang des Bêtes, The Blood of the Animals, a film about Parisian abattoirs. And he shows them at a children's matinee at the Venice Festival, and the kids are in stitches with laughter. And then he shows it again to a group called the Young Animal Club, and they too roar with laughter, apparently. Some people have said if, slaughterhouses are glass walls, we'd all be vegetarian. But it sounds that it's the opposite, that in fact, not only can we inure ourselves to the horror, but that we relish the horror. There's an absurd glee to the processing of animals, as well as a numbed horror to it. How do you compute these two things?
Yeah, I think there is no computing for some of us, but while I was writing this book, I went to this small farm somewhere in Victoria. I can't remember where it was. And they were having a tour because they were trying to get people to know about the fact that they had this really tiny boutique abattoir that was built on site of this farm. This is a really, really frightening place because the farmer and his mentor interlace almost evangelical Christian discourse with boutique slaughter discourse, and like the sort of the rights of the small farmer and the rights of the battler farmer. Like this is really interesting intertwining of a certain type of masculinity, a certain type of regionalism, a certain type of nationalism, and a certain type of sort of white Christianity. And they literally preached from the abattoir, like the slaughter facility that they were building, that literally had glass walls, because they were saying, you will be proud of what we do here. What we do here is something to feel proud of as small Australian farmers who are raising pigs. Upton Sinclair's novel talks about like the slaughterhouse tours that happened. They are still happening. You can watch slaughterhouse tours in Denmark on the internet. There's this real pride in saying, look, come inside. We have a calm environment. What we do here is something to be proud of, not hidden away. So that glass walls argument has absolutely been co-opted. And it's also for television shows where they've got these sort of severely staged, managed visions of the happy animal, the happy farmed animal becoming like the somehow happy slaughtered animal, and then the happy eaters at the end. I can't talk to the kids who laugh at the Franju film. I can barely even watch that film. But the thing that I'll say about terms like processing and depopulation, and even that essay Inferno, is that part of what felt really important to me was bring those terms outside of their generic habitat and just allow them to be seen for what they are. And I realized, like, this was just to sort of call back to the very beginning of the conversation where I spoke about my monograph had all of these really moralizing tones, and I was trying to build these walls of argumentation against meat-eating practices and slaughter practices. And I realized, actually, I just have to let the language of that world speak for itself in a way that can't be so easily co-opted. That might happen in the mind of the reader, right? When they walk away and the word processing just means processing. And oh, that's a fine word, whatever people imagine, whatever clean, sort of sanitized vision that they have. The more I think about the deadened language of bureaucracy, the more frightening it becomes. I mean, we've all had those experiences of the language of politicians when they're talking about something that is a life or death matter, and they can speak about it almost as if it's administrational. This is exactly what the industry does, speaks about life and death matters as matters of administration, which for them, that is how it is seen. But it is up to us as writers to pick up that language and to turn it almost against its own purposes in the way that it's been used.
One of my thoughts I was trying to develop while reading is this notion of hybridity as well. So we have the terms that are very simple, such as processing, administration, which cover up, let's say, a complete world of violence and shit. But I also was interested in how hybridity, how that works in the sense that we are in an industrial complex, and the notion of work, the work the pig needs to do, the work the chicken needs to do, and the cow. And it's also a redefinition of work. What is work? Also because in Holland we actually have, and these are animal advocates who have founded a union for animals, which I find very troubling myself, talking about work and all these connotations that work has within a technological environment, let's say, an industry. So maybe you would have some more thoughts on that.
I don't think that you're insinuating this in your question, Jesseka, but it just occurs to me to say that in talking about animals who are held in captivity in concentrated animal feeding operations, every single day of their life is the labor of trying to survive up until the point of profitable death, like in inverted commas, that is a form of labor. It's not just standing around. People talk about that all the time. You see cows in a paddock and, oh, they've got a good life, haven't they? It's just like, why would you think that? What is this assumption that you are making? Because the fact is that there is labor that is going on in every moment. The physical force that a chicken who has been fattened to monstrous levels, the labor that it would take merely to stand up or to not break their own legs, bends my mind. And I would not want to think about it as anything other than the labor of breathing, the labor of standing, the labor of merely surviving. I think that labor really needs to be something that we keep picking at, we keep sort of uncovering, we keep opening out, because there are so many ways that we need to think about the labor of surviving in a situation that fully intends for you to die, and very, very soon.
So here's a bigger question. I mean, how does one teach creative writing, and how does one teach animal studies in such a world without the students shutting down?
Yeah, that is a good question. The parts in the book are talking about a course that I teach on. It has previously been called Contemporary Ecofiction. I've just changed it to being focused on environmental writing across sort of all forms. I have in the past just had 1 week where I will have a very openly sort of, let's think about the industrial slaughter complex. I have a heap of writing exercises that I can draw on if students are just completely refusing for whatever reason. I don't know their reason to engage. This year, when I taught that week, I had one student turn up and eat chicken nuggets for the entire class, which felt like a really incredible, intense move. That was a first. I've had a lot of silence in the past. This felt like the first most provocative thing that has happened in that space. And silent. Talk about creative protest. This student didn't need to say anything, and didn't say anything in this entire class, just sat there silently eating nuggets. It just felt like absolute gauntlet, like it was a real protest against the texts, against the assumptions of the questions that I was asking, and of the space that I was setting up. We did a lot of writing that week. Actually, in another class, a completely different subject, students in that same week had been set sections from my book. And so they were coming into this week being taught about sort of slaughterhouse literature by me having read part of the book. and spoke to me afterwards and just tried to open up space, I think, where they could feel like they could engage with this topic. But the classroom was not the space for that in this scenario of last semester. So that is something I am really trying to figure out, how to negotiate the different levels of hostility and defensiveness that are brought up when students are invited to read this work. And I am really open in my classes. I'm so clear that if the best thing you can do for this class or any given week is just to read one of the readings really, really well, that's fine. That's all you need to do. Come to class, be prepared to talk about it. If you have the energy, if you're not being pulled in 1,000 different directions, you can read everything, do that. I have that in a way because teaching a class on environmental writing really seriously brings on climate anxiety for students. So it's a bit of a coping mechanism. This is something that I'm going to continue to work on because, you know, Deborah Levy's Diary of a Steak, like, we all need to reckon with this book in a world in which bovine spongiform encephalopathy exists and has existed, right? We need to think about all of these things in a world of increasing zoonotic disease. If we're not reckoning with these texts, we're quite simply not reckoning with the times that we're living in. So I have to keep trying to find the ways to work with these texts in the class. So it's still something that I'm struggling with. How do we set this conversation up when there's so much resistance, so much hostility, and some students are feeling really emboldened to act out their hostilities in various ways in the classroom?
Are there examples of students who do sort of engage and sort of for whom it's a revelation and that in fact starts to make them think about their own writing even, perhaps?
I'm glad that you asked, because I went to the really negative place there, didn't I? I'm sort of supervising students who come out of that course and want to keep going. So I've supervised a number of theses that will think about feminist animal studies, and these people just want to go further and further and further with thinking and writing into this space. So that absolutely happens. But that happens mostly when it becomes a one-on-one supervisory situation.
Be interesting to know, to make a study even of what happens once the veil is taken away and suddenly this reality emerges, and then you want to continue. And one of the beautiful quotes relates to the teaching: resist the seductions of narrative coherence, pitch your tent with those who reach towards explosive, inventive, and creative lines of more than human communication, and who are often called hysterical, mad, or irrational. Is this the way to continue thinking and writing about the violence in industrial complexes? Or is this perhaps even what we need to do, regardless of the topics we're writing about now in our, let's say, the Anthropocene? Is this the only way to write, perhaps even?
No, I think so. I've been thinking about the way that teleological narratives, or that progressive narrative where the hero leaves home, goes on a journey, and then arrives at a place where he gets all of his prizes or whatever it is that he gets at the end. You know, that sort of really traditional arc-shaped narrative structure is something that students come into the creative writing course. For them, that is narrative. Like, does it flow? Where's the arc? What's your climax? And this is big blockbuster type structure. And it's a real problem because it is a structure that has really affected the way that we are thinking about climate crisis, the way that we are thinking about what happens when someone is born, when they live, and when they die, and who the hero is. Pushing against these narrative structures is so vital because they are actually so connected to how we think about everyday life and what matters and what doesn't matter. Even the idea that you could write about a man who doesn't quite succeed in cleaning up the shit of the pigsties that he's working in, that is an anti-teleological narrative, because all that happens is that he collapses and cannot figure out if he's a man or a pig anymore. But this is more true to life, I think, than the hero's journey. It's just that we are so inculcated, who is this we? I don't know who this we is, right? So, but within the creative writing degree, what I've found is that students and people in my world at least are so inculcated into the idea of that progressivist structure, that teleological structure, the narrative arc, that it really starts to shape how we think about the value of beings. Are they capable of that journey? And if not, are they truly worth thinking about? Are they worth having narratives told about them? Like, I really do think that we should only tell the stories of those who would welcome us into their life world. We can't just presume to be able to tell the stories of pigs without doing a heap of work to sort of say, can I please make myself worthy of putting some of the experiences that I can imagine from my research out into the world, right? You have to make yourself welcome to somebody's life world in order to write about it. This is what I think. That really seductive narrative of coherence is antithetical to actually telling the story or the experience of someone working in a pig shed where everything is collapsing. That is not a narrative of coherence. So this is something that I think is really, really important if we are going to actually properly reckon with what we are doing to the earth and to other species. I can't do that through a narrative of coherence, because I think there will always be something that is conveniently left out because it's too big, it's too confusing, it's too much like the knot that you can't undo to sit inside that narrative. And I'm more interested in holding the pieces that don't seem to fit with anything else. They just sit together and they're ragged and they're ugly and they're awful and they just sit there. But I'm not going to do them any favors by smoothing them out or making them easily readable. That to me would just be terrible. Like, I would be doing a terrible thing to make that easily readable.
We barely covered the extraordinary range and depth that you plumb in this remarkable book, Hayley. I want to thank you so much, Hayley, for writing this book, Abandon Every Hope, Essays for the Dead. Kudos to Upswell Publishing for publishing this book. And may it have many readers all over the world and be translated. Good luck to the translator, whoever you may be. And Jesseka, thank you also for being so engaged with this book.
Thank you so much for this conversation. This has been a really, really good conversation, good to talk about these things, even though I hate the fact that we have to talk about these things.
We will conclude with you reading the section about the sheep on the ship.
There's no way to enter well into this chapter. This chapter is called a thanatography. There has been an explosion in the engine room of a cargo ship. 67,000 sheep are left burning or drowning. They will not become earth but sea. Another ship spends 2 months at sea, finds nowhere to dock. The animals on board are thought to be carrying scabby mouth, a highly contagious viral disease of sheep, goats, and occasionally humans. They are floating in limbo as the rope of life breaks loose. 6,000 die on board. A vessel capsizes and sinks while berthed in Brazil. The water moves, the wind shakes. Here is death. 5,000 drown. 6,000 drown in a typhoon. Each one, like running in a dream, tries but cannot move. The havoc of a ship. Eyes sliding everywhere, gripping only onto blue. More than 85,000 on board. Salmonella, shy feeding, heat. In sickness, they find death. 5,800 of them. One ship capsizes off the Black Sea coast, almost 14,000 drown. How terrifying to be plunged into the water, to see the sea flicker all lit up blue, the strangeness of a blue death, to be tied suddenly to the pull of the sea. Another ship, a notorious ship, is loaded with 45,000 sheep and a few camels. It sets sail. Soon it takes on another 30,000 sheep and some cows. This is one of the few two-tier ships which allow for animals to be packed into 2 levels of pens on each deck. This means the ship lacks any real ventilation. Ventilation on board such a ship at any rate is called forced ventilation, which means the temperature outside the ship, say 40 degrees, is the temperature at which the ship is so-called ventilated. Sheep on deck might reasonably ask if the wind has been put to sleep. This ship sails for 21 days. Those unable to reach food and water, unable to lie down, unable to regulate their body temperature, collapse in excrement. One and then another and another and another slam down on their knees, the hot shock of falling on your knees, one and then another, of taking 300 breaths per minute, of foaming at the mouth. 4,000 die this way. The very air puts a stop to their breathing. Years later, the same ship reloads in 44-degree heat. I try to picture the sheep staring at the pool of the sea. In a daze of heat they are boarded, their lives unfinished.
The Culture and Animals Foundation. Think, create, explore, celebrate.